scholars, but they were not communication specialists because they were the one who made communication a subject to be studied individually, right? So before communication being a subject of study, subject of academia, the primitive scholars also were not communication specialists, but they were psychologists, some were educationologists, some were politicians, and some were what we call philosophers. Somehow, those primitive scholars investigated and they researched the contemporary media by then. ඒ කාලේ තිබ්බ media ඒගොල්ලන් study කරන්න පටන් ගත්තා, and the impact on that media on individual and the social behavior of individual, right? What we talked in this slide, Puta. Here we talked how communication affect on mind and behavior of an individual. No, that's unlike thing. Likewise, the primitive scholars also, they examined, they researched how this media affect on this communication, affect on individuals' mind and behavior, and as well how it affect on the society and the social interrelationships of that particular individual, right? These studies and these researchers led the pathway to make communication studies an individual and independent arena of study, right? And communication, as I said previous, before communication making to an independent or individual's field of study, communication was not a subject of study. No. So the scholars was also not communicologists, okay? They were not specialized for communication, but somehow they studied about communication, studied about the importance of communication, right? And therefore, communication was studied under three main discourses by then. They were psychology, sociology, and political science. Why psychologists, sociologists, and political science specialists tend to study communication is what they have seen from the very beginning is that communication is something very related to the mind of an individual, right? අපි කොච්චර කිව්වත් වැඩක් නෑ පුතා ඒක කෙනෙක්ගේ ඔළුවට යන්නේ නැත්තම්, right? That's why we call mind is the very important thing in communication. Therefore, psychologists tend to study the importance of communication in psychology, right? And communication, මම තනියම හිතලා තේරුමක් නෑ පුතා if I do not complain, but we communicate with it too. මම ඒක ඔයාගෙත් එක්ක communicate කරේ නැත්නම් ඒකෙන් තේරුමක් නෑ, right? That means it directly affects on the social interrelationships and that social interrelationships, right? Studying social interrelationships is a key component in sociology, right? Therefore, sociologists tend to study how communication is happening, how communication is behaving within sociology. And in earlier social elite politics, they used communication to put their power on commons, right? එයාලගේ බලය සාමාන්‍ය මිනිස්සු මත දාන්න ඒගොල්ලෝ පාවිච්චි කරා. Therefore, communication was very important in political science. Therefore, political scientists also tend to study why communication is, especially in my field, in political science. Therefore, communication is firstly studied in the discourses in academic subjects such like psychology, sociology, and political basics, right? These basics of communication studies were formed by the primitive scholars Charles Horton Cooley, and he was a sociologist, and Walter Lippmann, a political anthropologist, for John Dewey, a psychologist. Okay, and the main purpose of communication studies is to study how communication functions as a central factor in human experience. Like, before to get into this sentence, we have to clarify what is human experience here, right? In the second point, I have mentioned that human experience is how people create and share messages, right? How people create means how people create information within them, and how people share those information with the other people, and how people behave on those information and how interpret those information and how they act on that, right? So if we substitute this sentence, in this word, the purpose of communication studies is to how to study how communication functions as a central factor in how people create and share messages, how people behave when and how people interpret in them, and how they act on them. Right? This is the main purpose of communication studies, to study how communication functions as a central factor in human. Communication studies is lively, dynamic, and active. I think you can get these points, right? Communication is always live because um, communication is always happening. Though we communicate with our environment, we live, and our environment is also live. Sorry. Therefore, communication is always lively. And as I said, even communication is developing even in now. In the moment we are talking, the communication is developing, right? Therefore, communication is dynamic, and always communication is active. I whether you are not speaking a single word with me, if I am only the person who is talking here, you think what I'm talking, that you are actively participated in this process, right? Therefore, we call that communication studies is lively, dynamic, and active.